The Mega Knight is probably one of the most hated cards in Clash Royale history. Every mention of an annoying or even an overpowered card leads you back to the Mega Knight. And for any player that has ever played this game, you can't deny that you at least once developed a hatred for this card. And with the new evolution recently added into the game, the Mega Knight has become as popular as ever. But what if none of this ever happened? What if the Mega Knight never got added to Clash Royale? In this video, I want to explore how Clash Royale would look like without its most hated card ever. There are specific metas that I want to talk about where I think the Mega Knight had the most impact in, and therefore the absence of the Mega Knight from these metas would have tremendous impacts. I don't want to go over every meta since the Mega Knight was released, since I think this would be super boring and I feel like I would be repeating myself over and over again. So for the metas that I don't talk about, it can be assumed that the Mega Knight had such little use that its absence would not actually have a severe impact on the meta. But I will talk about more recent metas, since they make the most sense to talk about, especially with the evolved Mega Knight. When the Mega Knight first got added, it was extremely popular in top ladder, with it acting as a support, defense / counter-attack potential card to popular win conditions like Giant, Hog Rider, and Miner. The Mega Knight saw little use in lower and mid ladder, since being a legendary card, it was extremely hard to level up before magic items were introduced into the game, so there was no point in using an underleveled Mega Knight when these players could continue using overleveled mid ladder cards like Elite Barbarians. So the absence of the Mega Knight would have minimal impact on what would be happening in mid ladder. However, top ladder would be completely different. Since the Mega Knight appeared most in control decks and beatdown decks at the time, without Mega Knight, Logbait and Golem Knight Witch beatdown would likely trample over the competition, partly because the Mega Knight would actually do pretty well against these archetypes. The Three Musketeers would have also probably become much more popular, since they were already popular prior to the Mega Knight's official release, so the fact that there wouldn't be a card with the spawn damage and jump mechanic that the Mega Knight has would allow players to make better use of the overpowered late 2017 Three Musketeers. On top of that, the Bandit's usage would likely drop, since around half the time the Mega Knight was played, the Bandit was played in the same deck. And many times the Bandit was used with the Mega Knight, it was because of a glitch in the game at the time, where it would constantly dash if it was behind the Mega Knight. So without this glitch, the Bandit would not be used in the same way that it was before. The December 2017 meta is notable as the release of the Royal Ghost and the buff to the Skeleton Barrel caused the Mega Knight to become very popular. The Inferno Dragon's usage had increased, since players at the time noted that they seemed to be facing Mega Knight more often. So if there was no Mega Knight, the Inferno Dragon would likely tumble to irrelevance within the meta. The meta was unique in that it saw the rise of the usage of spells like Rocket and Fireball, probably because of the increase in Siege deck's popularity at the time. Without Mega Knight, cards like Hog Rider would likely see little use in top ladder because of the prominence of bait and beatdown decks. The Royal Ghost replaced the Bandit and the Knight as a cheap ground tank, so this led to a decrease in popularity of Logbait. In fact, Mega Knight actually appeared in the most popular deck at the time because he paired so well with the Ghost and Skeleton Barrel. So the absence of the Mega Knight in this meta would probably mean Siege decks would increase in popularity, as the Mega Knight decks at the time capitalized on the defensive and tanking abilities of the Mega Knight, and the Mega Knight was the only high hit points card in these decks. And since the Royal Ghost replaced the Knight, which previously would have been one of the best tanks against X-Bow, I think there would have been two possibilities for the meta that would follow. It would either result in beatdown being extremely popular, or it would result in siege decks being extremely popular. Three Musketeers would still likely be popular as well, and PEKKA decks would decrease in popularity, as it would become apparent that the PEKKA would be too much of an overcommitment if there was no Mega Knight. Mid-ladder didn't really see much use of the Mega Knight, and when it was used, overleveled Elite Barbarians would likely crush the Mega Knight's chances of thriving in this environment. So I doubt that if the Mega Knight was never added, mid-ladder would have a significant change. At the beginning of 2018, the Mega Knight received a nerf to his spawn damage and splash damage, and combined with the PEKKA bridge spam meta of mid-2018, this made the Mega Knight useless in competitive play. So I'll just consider him as so unused in top ladder that if he never got added, it wouldn't have a major impact on the meta. The same can be said for lower to mid ladder, with the Mega Knight having around a 5 to 7% usage rate on all of ladder throughout 2018. Even though it did receive some buffs in mid-2018, lower rarity mid ladder cards like Elite Barbarians, Wizard, Witch, and Valkyrie was so much easier to level up, and therefore reap the rewards of overleveling compared to an underleveled Mega Knight. So not only was the Mega Knight a walking negative elixir trade to competitive players, but even to lower ladder players, it was simply not worth it to play an objectively worse card at a lower level than what they already knew was a viable strategy. Throughout early to mid-2019, the Mega Knight saw little use, partly due to how strong the PEKKA was and how rampant beatdown was becoming, not only in the form of Giant or Golem beatdown, but also with Lava Hound Balloon. Since the Mega Knight was terrible against these decks, it provided no value to competitive players, so it rarely faded into irrelevance into a similar position that it was in 2018. The Mega Knight was becoming more popular in mid-ladder, since players began to level it up, and since the Mega Knight was easy to play and perfectly countered so many mid-ladder cards like Hog Rider, Wizard, Witch, Elite Barbarians, and so on, it was slowly becoming popular. However, the end of 2019 is where the Mega Knight would truly shine. I have mentioned this in several of my videos, but this was when Clash Royale decided to buff the Witch and the Night Witch, and also release the Elixir Golem into the game. And I can't think of a better card that would defend this combination better than the Mega Knight could. The Mega Knight was rampant throughout the Elixir Golem Double Witch meta. Its popularity was partly due to a buff to Wall Breakers, which paired extremely well with the Mega Knight. The Mega Knight had a 15% usage rate, which considering the meta that it was in, seemed quite low, considering the Witch had over a 40% usage rate. So it was clear that just because the Mega Knight had its spawn damage and jump mechanic, it was popular. Otherwise, it was a pretty below average card. If the Mega Knight never got added and this meta occurred exactly as it did, then I think the results would be quite different. It was clear from this meta that the Mega Knight was used to counter the main meta cards, with his spawn damage being able to hit and basically kill both Witches on impact, and his splash damage being able to tear through an Elixir Golem, especially if paired with something like a Baby Dragon or Witch. So if the Mega Knight wasn't even an option in this meta, I would predict that the Witch and the Night Witch would actually see more use, and cards like the Elixir Golem would probably be more popular. But it was also around this period where two mid-ladder cards would be added, the Elixir Golem in late 2019 and the Firecracker in early 2020. Leading up to 2020, the Mega Knight was now extremely popular in top ladder, and even more popular in mid ladder. This was mostly due to the overpowered wall breakers, and once again the Bandit rising to popularity, which led to the Mega Knight rising to popularity. If the Mega Knight didn't exist at this time, we would likely never see the mini PEKKA be so popular in this meta. The same can be said about the Bandit. The Mega Knight best paired with the Bandit, so it was almost like the Mega Knight depended on the Bandit to be viable in competitive play and vice versa. At this time, the Elixir Golem and Battle Healer turned out to be a very toxic synergy, and the Mega Knight was able to counter this pretty well. So if the Mega Knight never got added, we would probably see the Elixir Golem Healer combo be way more popular than it already was. Royal Hogs and Hog Rider would have also been way more popular, since the Earthquake was so popular at this time, and these cards synergized extremely well with the Earthquake. With how popular the Wizard and Witch were in mid-ladder, it would likely be that without the Mega Knight, Elite Barbarians and Mini PEKKA would have absolutely dominated the meta, especially since the Mini PEKKA was already so strong in early 2020. And even worse, the absence of a card that counters the Elixir Golem Healer Night Witch combination so well would mean that the Elixir Golem would have terrorized mid-ladder as a whole. The Bowler would probably rise to popularity as the most popular card in mid-ladder during this time, since it would be easy to level up and also be able to counter the mid-ladder meta cards like Elite Barbs, Mini PEKKA, Elixir Golem, and Hog Rider, just to name a few. It's clear that without the Mega Knight, as much as players would hate to agree, the early 2020 meta would have genuinely been worse than if there was a Mega Knight in the game. And as time went on, the Mega Knight began to become way more popular to mid-ladder cards as they could level them up easier, so now the meta changes. When magic items were added to Clash Royale, this is when the overleveling problem became apparent, especially with the Mega Knight and other mid-ladder cards. The thing about the Mega Knight is that if it is overleveled, the interactions that previously didn't favor the Mega Knight at equal levels suddenly change, and this is important, especially in mid-ladder, since the best counters to the Mega Knight would have been the Mini PEKKA or the Prince, or even the Dark Prince. But if the Mega Knight is overleveled, it can actually overcome these counters, which therefore results in the Mega Knight becoming extremely versatile, since it is an amazing defensive and offensive card when overleveled. There's a great explanation by Abdod in his video of what makes a card mid-ladder, so I recommend that you watch that. So now when the Mega Knight is overleveled, we have a card that can now kill fireballies and possibly even mini tanks if the level advantage is great enough when it spawns in, is able to deal fireball levels of damage when it jumps, and deal splash damage on every hit. Since the Mega Knight is so easy to play and can provide so much potential, it's no surprise that following the magic update, every everyone was upgrading their Mega Knights and therefore it was being used a lot more than it used to. This would continue the ongoing hatred towards the Mega Knight. So if the Mega Knight was never added, then players would never be able to upgrade their Mega Knights, meaning they would likely dump all their magic items on different cards. When brainstorming which cards I think players would first dump their wild cards into, there were three main candidates that came to mind: the Mini P.E.K.K.A, the Elite Barbarians, and the Wizard. The absence of the Mega Knight would also mean that players would no longer need to invest in higher level Inferno Towers and Inferno Dragons, meaning the usage rate of these cards would probably plummet to none in mid-ladder, especially since it's extremely popular in mid-ladder to run swarm cards like Minions, Bats, or Skeleton Army, so these buildings would end up having little use. I would predict that the usage of the P.E.K.K.A would also drop, since it becomes too expensive to justify when there is no Mega Knight, and an overleveled Mini P.E.K.K.A can do the same job. In fact, the Mega Knight's influence is so great that I think even the Valkyrie usage rate would probably decrease slightly, since it becomes less useful. This kind of environment is perfect for two cards to thrive: the Electro Giant and the Elite Barbarians. Oh, and adding to that actually, the Elixir Golem. Since usage rates of the P.E.K.K.A and Inferno Tower would likely decrease, Electro Giant would actually probably become a pretty broken mid-ladder card. But if the Electro Giant didn't become popular, then the Elite Barbarians would most definitely rise to the top. The most reliable hard counter to Elite Barbarians is the Mega Knight, but the Bowler is also a great counter. With no actual hard counter to overlevel Elite Barbarians, they would probably become the most popular mid-ladder card. I can also see a world where the Royal Giant would become extremely popular if the Elite Barbarians don't rise to popularity, since the usage of the P.E.K.K.A and the Inferno Tower would tank, no pun intended. But then again, without the Mega Knight, the Elixir Golem would also become extremely hard to deal with, since the Mega Knight would be a great counter to the Elixir Golem. But I don't see how this would really work out, since the Wizard, Witch, and Valkyrie would either maintain popularity or increase. To me, the most likely course of events in this order is for Elite Barbarians to become the main meta card of mid-ladder, and then over time, the Bowler would start to rise in popularity, since it counters the Elite Barbarians amazingly, as well as countering Hog Rider, Wizards, Witches, and even the Mini P.E.K.K.A if it is overleveled. In fact, an overleveled Bowler would be so strong that I can actually see how it would become the new annoying mid-ladder menace, since it would be so hard to deal with. Now that I think about it, the Bowler and Mega Knight are more similar than meets the eye. Both are absolutely broken when overleveled, both are pretty tanky, both are considered below average cards in top ladder, and both are extremely annoying when they are meta, since they both feel extremely low skill. So I think that from 2021 to mid-2023, mid-ladder decks would most popularly feature the following cards in this order: Bowler, Elite Barbarians, Wizard, Witch, Firecracker, and an overleveled Tesla. Some possible win conditions that I can see as being popular include the Balloon or the Electro Giant, or maybe even the Elixir Golem, although this is probably the least likely. Hog Rider may still be used, but I think this would quickly phase out of the meta if Bowler is the main mid-ladder menace, since the Hog Rider gets hard countered by the Bowler. And for those that notice, I say up to mid-2023, since I think the meta would actually have a massive shift when evolutions first get added. I think that the Monk would also probably fit really well into mid-ladder decks when he first got released, since he counters most mid-ladder cards pretty well with his reflection ability. But since he was a champion, it would be highly unlikely for mid-ladder players to unlock him in his broken state, especially since at the time, champions were locked behind level 14. So now when evolutions become a part of the conversation, I think the discussion turns on its head. Going into the June 2023 season, we can expect Bowler, Elite Barbarians, and Wizard to be meta in mid-ladder. However, we know that cards like the Royal Giant and the Firecracker got evolutions, and since these were so broken, I can see two possibilities following. Since at the time a deck could only have one evolution, I think that if the Firecracker became the most popular mid-ladder evolution, and without the Mega Knight being able to instantly kill the Firecracker, the Bowler would become a pretty bad card, especially since the Firecracker can keep pushing herself away and not only chip the tower, but also the user can keep getting value by distracting the Bowler. I think that this would lead to a new era of mid-ladder of faster paced cycle decks that still have the Elite Barbarians, but now start to include Hog Rider and much more Fireball, especially since Arrows was no longer able to kill the Firecracker. I think mid-ladder players would realize that heavier cards like Elite Barbarians and Bowler, which can't reliably kill the Firecracker in the way that Mega Knight can, would be less viable, and they would be forced to switch up their strategy. history, and without an annoying Mega Knight to easily counter the Hog Firecracker push, I can for sure see how the Hog Rider would become the most popular win condition in mid-ladder. But if the Evolved Royal Giant became meta, which I highly doubt since mid-ladder players always seem to use high DPS cards, so the Evolved Royal Giant would never even get the chance to use its special ability, which is to kill Swarm. And since a Tesla can counter the Evolved Royal Giant, I see this meta being the least likely of the two. It was already clear that in around July 2023, the Hog Rider was the most popular win condition in mid-ladder, so I wouldn't be surprised if his usage would jump to close to 40% without the Mega Knight. I think this meta would continue to remain stagnant until these mid-ladder players could get their next evolution, which would be over 6 months later. And funnily enough, around 6 months after the first evolutions got announced, we saw more somewhat popular cards get evolutions, such as the Knight and the Bats. I should note that during this time in competitive play, the Mega Knight was almost a dead card, partly due to the fact that Lava Hound and Goblin Giant was so popular in the meta at the time, but also since the Evolved Knight was just better for less than half the elixir. But because not all mid-ladder players got access to the broken Evolved Knight, Mega Knight didn't suffer as much of a drop in usage as it did in competitive play. But again, if the Mega Knight didn't even exist at this time, and some mid-ladder players were able to get the Evolved Knight, I think he would become pretty popular, since he could counter the Valkyrie and also be able to easily tank ranged attackers, such as the Wizard or the minions, allowing for a Hog Rider to reach the tower with close to full health. And in the case of Evolved Bats, they were basically minions for cheaper, so it makes sense for a mid-ladder player who was already using minions or minion horde to make a swift replacement and allow them to use heavier cards more often, since their cycle would be faster. So now we get to the Evolved Mega Knight. It's clear that Clash Royale added the Evolved Mega Knight and the Evolved PEKKA, since they were two of the game's most iconic cards, both being 7 elixir tanks that fill different roles in different decks. And funnily enough, both cards are used so differently based on what part of ladder you are playing in. The PEKKA is pretty decent in top ladder, since she can be used to defend beatdown decks pretty well, and the Mega Knight is used in mid-ladder decks, since, well, he's so broken when overleveled. So without the Mega Knight being added into the game, we see a pretty crazy revelation unfold. The Evolved PEKKA may have never got added into the game. It's entirely possible that in order to support their UFC sponsorship, Clash Royale would have made E-Barbs or Mini PEKKA evolution alongside another popular card in Clash Royale, maybe even the Bowler evolution instead of the PEKKA evolution. And given how hated the Elite Barbarians would have been at this time, as I predicted, this would probably be received by the community in the same way as the Mega Knight evolution was. I think that the most likely scenario would be that the Evolved Bowler and the Evolved Elite Barbarians would be added, since the Bowler tends to be a higher skill card and counters the Elite Barbarians, and this was the trend with the Evolved PEKKA and the Evolved Mega Knight. We would probably see a pretty similar mechanic to the Evolved Bomber with the Evolved Bowler, but just a larger splash radius and dealing knockback, since this kind of fits with the theme of USC, although this seems pretty stupid when you first think about it. With the E-Barbs, I can definitely see Clash Royale giving them the same ability as the current Mega Knight evolution does, which is the ability to throw smaller troops and then attack them. And if it was the Evolved Mini PEKKA, it makes sense for it to have a similar mechanic to the Super Mini PEKKA, where it heals off pancakes every kill much like the Evolved PEKKA. So what would the meta that would follow be? I mean, without PEKKA, the meta would definitely be much more chill than it is currently. In fact, the Evolved PEKKA is so overpowered that a broken evolution like the Evolved Mega Knight is not even seeing that much play. So that just goes to show the influence that the Evolved PEKKA has on the meta. In fact, it's part of the reason why Goblin Gang and Evo Ice Spirit is so popular. I think that without the Evolved Mega Knight and the Evolved PEKKA, the Evolved Ice Spirit would be a dead card. And the same goes for the Evolved Skeletons. The only reason these cards are meta is because they can counter the Evolved PEKKA and the Goblinstein extremely well, and given how broken the Evolved E-Barbs would be on release, I think that this would skyrocket the Evolved Bowler's usage, especially since he would be an excellent counter to the Goblinstein as well, who was also extremely popular when they first released. So I think that not only would the Evolved Bowler be at the top of the usage charts in top ladder, but I also think the Bowler would be super high in the usage charts of mid ladder as well. So that means that without the Evolved Mega Knight being in the game, he would single-handedly stop the Evolved PEKKA from being released, which would seem like it would save Clash Royale players from being in this truly brain-dead meta that we are currently in. But actually, it would give rise to an even more brain-dead meta with the Evolved Bowler and the Goblinstein being absolutely broken. And the reason I think the Bowler would be the card that would top the charts is because we saw something similar when the Little Prince first released. Since the Bowler could counter the Little Prince pretty well, but also what was popular at the time, Royal Recruits, he became super popular in top ladder, and I can see how this would repeat itself in the current meta. So would the game be in a better or a worse position if the Mega Knight didn't get added? At first, I thought the game would be healthier, since it would save mid-ladder players from having to face the same annoying and low skill card. But then I started to realize, mid-ladder would still be the toxic environment that it is. Mid-ladder players always adapt to make their strategies work, so that means there would still be a card with over 30% usage in mid-ladder, whether that be the Elite Barbarians or the Bowler, or even the Royal Giant. But in the case of top ladder and competitive play, I think the fact that the absence of the Mega Knight means the evolved PEKKA would have never been added, and that is super relieving, since the evolved PEKKA has terrorized the competitive scene for almost 2 months, and will continue to do so until Clash Royale nerfs her more. And although the Goblinstein would still be meta, I think the meta would still be more tame than the monstrosity it is currently, even if Clash Royale made evolved E-Barbs or evolved Bowler. Throughout the Mega Knight's history, he has been an annoying card to deal with in mid-ladder, but a below average card in top ladder. And I think even though we will never see another card like the Mega Knight and the evolved Mega Knight, the game would not be any less toxic. I can't see why players wouldn't continue to hate Elite Barbarians or the Royal Giant, especially as time goes on and more people upgrade them to higher levels. So yeah, I think without the Mega Knight, the game would be free from an absolute menace, but a similar amount of hate would just be redirected to other mid-ladder cards. I hope you enjoyed this video though. Thanks for watching.